Sit down, sweetheart. This is a courtroom, not a beauty pageant, and I don't have time for whatever theatrical performance you think you're about to give me. Judge Harold Whitman's voice cut through the stale air of courtroom 7B like a butcher's cleaver, and a few nervous chuckles rippled through the gallery behind her. He leaned back in his oversized leather chair, a smug little smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, clearly delighted by his own wit. Adrienne Carter didn't move. She didn't blink. She stood at the defendant's podium in her plain navy cardigan and inexpensive flats, her hands folded neatly in front of her, and she let the silence stretch just long enough to make every person in the room uncomfortable. "I'll stand, Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice perfectly even. "Unless, of course, standing is also against the rules in your courtroom." The smirk on Whitman's face faltered for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. He had no idea, absolutely no idea, that the woman he had just dismissed as a nuisance was about to become the single greatest professional disaster of his entire life. The rain in downtown Atlanta hadn't let up since dawn. It hammered against the tall, arched windows of the Fulton County Municipal Court building, turning the morning light into a gray, watery haze. To the dozens of anxious defendants packed into the wooden pews of courtroom 7B, it was just another miserable Tuesday in a string of miserable Tuesdays. To Adrienne Carter, it was the opening move in a chess match she had been preparing to play for over a year. Adrienne was a woman who had never been handed anything. At 41 years old, she had clawed her way from a two-bedroom apartment in the West End of Atlanta to one of the most powerful legal positions in the state of Georgia. Just 9 months earlier, she had been sworn in as the elected district attorney for Fulton County, the first black woman in the county's history to hold the office, and she had run on a single, unshakable promise. She would clean up the rot inside the very institutions that were supposed to deliver justice. But today, Adrienne was not the district attorney. Today, she was simply Ms. Carter, a citizen with a disputed jaywalking citation and a desperately ordinary appearance. She had stood in front of her bathroom mirror that morning and methodically dismantled every visual cue of her authority. The tailored charcoal suits she wore to press conferences stayed in the closet. The string of pearls her grandmother had left her stayed in the jewelry box. Her natural hair, which she usually wore in elegant twists for court appearances, was pulled back into a simple, low ponytail. She wore drugstore lip balm instead of lipstick. She carried a worn canvas tote bag instead of her usual briefcase. When she had looked at her reflection one last time before leaving the house, she had seen exactly what she wanted Judge Harold Whitman to see: an ordinary, working-class black woman who could be safely underestimated. The citation itself was almost laughably small. A patrol officer fresh out of the academy had written her up for crossing against the signal at a quiet intersection at 6:30 in the morning when there wasn't a car in sight for 3 blocks. Her chief of staff, Marcus, had practically begged her to let the office handle it with a single phone call. "Adrienne, it's a $40 ticket. You don't need to walk into that lion's den. Pay it, void it, forget about it," he had pleaded. But Adrienne had refused. For 18 months, complaints had been quietly piling up on her desk about Judge Harold Whitman of the Fulton County Municipal Court. Complaints from public defenders, from legal aid attorneys, from advocacy groups, all of them describing the same pattern of racially charged condescension, casual cruelty, and stunningly disproportionate sentencing. Reports could be dismissed. Statistics could be challenged. But what Adrienne wanted, what she needed, was first-hand experience. She wanted to feel the weight of Whitman's contempt land directly on her own shoulders. She wanted to see him underestimate her, mock her, and dig his own grave one shovelful at a time. Adrienne had taken the MARTA train downtown that morning, deliberately bypassing the black SUV and security detail that normally drove her to work. She sat in the middle of a packed train car, surrounded by nurses heading to early shifts, construction workers in dusty boots, and high school students hunched over their phones. She watched a young black mother juggle a stroller, a diaper bag, and a sleeping toddler while a businessman in an expensive suit refused to give up his seat, and Adrienne felt the familiar slow burn of frustration that had driven her into law in the first place. These were the people she had sworn an oath to serve. These were the faces that would never see the inside of her 10th floor office, but who were dragged through municipal courtrooms like cattle through a slaughterhouse chute, processed, fined, and discarded by men like Harold Whitman. When she stepped off the train at 5 Point Station and walked the 4 blocks to the courthouse, the rain soaked through her cardigan and plastered loose strands of hair to her forehead. She didn't bother to fix it. Looking disheveled, looking exhausted, looking exactly like the kind of woman Whitman had built his entire career on bullying. That was the entire point. She passed through the metal detectors without incident, the board security guards barely glancing at her ID, and she rode the slow, creaking elevator up to the 7th floor with a man muttering angrily to himself about a custody dispute and a teenage girl crying silently into the sleeve of her hoodie. The hallway outside courtroom 7B was packed with humanity, weary, anxious, working-class humanity, the kind of people who had taken unpaid days off to be there, and who were desperately calculating how much this morning was going to cost them in lost wages. Adrian slipped into a seat in the back row of the gallery and pulled out the small leather notebook she had brought specifically for this occasion. She set her canvas tote bag at her feet, folded her hands in her lap, and became invisible. Around her, the defendants whispered to each other in low, frightened voices. "I heard he gave a guy 90 days for talking back. My cousin said he charges people extra fees that aren't even on the citation. Just say yes, sir, and no, sir, and try not to look him in the eye." The bailiff, a thick-necked man with a buzz cut, paced the front of the courtroom with the air of a prison guard, occasionally barking at someone to silence their phone or sit up straight. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting a sickly yellow tint over everything. The American flag in the corner hung limp and faded. The room itself seemed to have been deliberately designed to crush the human spirit before the judge even arrived. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak door behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff's voice boomed across the room. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Harold Whitman presiding. Court is now in session." Judge Whitman swept in with the practiced flourish of a man who had spent 22 years cultivating his own mythology. He was 63 years old, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with a head of silver hair he combed back in a way that suggested he still thought it was 1985. His robes were freshly pressed. His half-moon reading glasses were perched on the end of his nose in a calculated affectation of intellectual gravity. He had been a mediocre prosecutor in his 30s, a marginally less mediocre defense attorney in his 40s, and had ridden a wave of good old boy political connections onto the municipal bench, where he had been content to lord over the lowest rung of the justice system for over 2 decades. He had never been elevated to a higher court, and the bitterness of that fact had calcified inside him into something genuinely ugly. Whitman climbed the 3 steps to his throne and settled in, surveying the gallery the way a feudal lord might survey his peasants. "Let's see what fresh batch of geniuses we have today," he said into the microphone, loud enough for everyone to hear, and a few of the more cowardly courthouse regulars laughed obligingly. "Call the first case, and let's try to keep the excuses creative this morning. I'm in a mood." Adrian opened her notebook and uncapped her pen. The clock on the wall read 9:02. By 9:03, she had already begun writing. The first defendant called to the podium was a thin, elderly black man named Mr. Eugene Patterson, who walked with a noticeable limp and clutched a manila folder to his chest like it was a life preserver. He had been cited for an expired vehicle registration, and Adrian watched as he tried, in a soft, respectful voice, to explain that his wife had been in hospice care for the last 4 months, and the renewal notice had simply slipped through the cracks during the worst weeks of his life. He had brought documentation. He had brought the death certificate. He had brought a letter from the hospice nurse. He held the folder out toward the bench with trembling hands. Whitman didn't take it. He didn't even look at it. "Mr. Patterson," the judge sighed, removing his reading glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose as if the man's grief was personally inconveniencing him. "Do you know how many sob stories I hear in this courtroom every single week? Every one of you has a dying relative, Every one of you has a hard luck case. The law doesn't care about your feelings, sir. The law cares whether your registration was current. Was it current? Yes or no? Mr. Patterson's voice cracked. No, sir, but I was just trying to. Fine of $250, Whitman snapped, banging his gavel. Pay the clerk, next case. The old man stood frozen at the podium for a moment, his folder still extended toward the bench, his mouth open in disbelief. The bailiff stepped forward and gently guided him away. Adrian's pen moved across her notebook in quick, precise strokes. Refused to review evidentiary documentation. Mocked bereavement. Maximum fine for first offense. No prior record. Case after case unfolded in the same pattern. A young black woman in a fast food uniform was fined $400 for a broken taillight she had already gotten an estimate to repair. A Latino teenager with no prior record was sentenced to 30 days of community service for riding a bicycle on the sidewalk. A middle-aged white man with a similar minor infraction, however, received nothing more than a verbal warning and a chuckled comment about how "we've all been there, brother." The pattern was so blatant, so unashamed, that Adrian almost couldn't believe it was happening in broad daylight in 2026. She filled 3 full pages of her notebook in under 90 minutes. Differential treatment based on race, mocking tone with defendants of color, conversational warmth with white defendants. Disproportionate fines, refusal to consider context, public humiliation as deliberate strategy. She watched Whitman lean over the bench and ask a young black mother if she had considered using birth control before bringing more problems into the system. She watched him tell a Vietnamese immigrant with limited English that, if you're going to live in America, you should learn how to read American street signs. She watched him fine a homeless veteran $200 for sleeping on a public bench and then quip, "Maybe next time try a homeless shelter, hero." Each comment was a small dagger, and each one was being faithfully recorded by the court stenographer, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who had clearly long ago stopped being shocked by anything Harold Whitman said. Adrian made a mental note of the stenographer's name plate, Margaret Holloway. That woman, Adrian realized, was going to become one of the most important witnesses in the entire case she was building. What struck Adrian most, however, was the silence. The terrible, suffocating silence of the gallery. No one objected. No one walked out. No one even whispered too loudly. Whitman had constructed a perfect little kingdom of fear, and everyone in it, the bailiff, the clerk, the public defenders, the defendants themselves, had been trained to accept his abuse as the cost of doing business in his courtroom. He had been doing this for 22 years. 22 years of unchecked cruelty. 22 years of nobody with enough power to stop him ever bothering to sit in the back row and watch. Until today. Adrian flipped to a fresh page in her notebook just as the clerk's tinny voice called out, "Case number 264471, City of Atlanta versus Adrian Carter." She closed the notebook calmly, slipped it into her tote bag, stood up, and began her slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle toward the podium. Show time. Judge Whitman didn't look up as Adrian approached the defendant's podium. He was scribbling something on his docket sheet with the bored irritation of a man counting down the minutes until his lunch break. The bailiff motioned for Adrian to stand still and be silent until addressed. She complied. She stood at the podium with her hands folded politely in front of her, her tote bag at her feet, her expression composed into the same mild, slightly nervous look she had been studying on the faces of defendants all morning. When Whitman finally raised his eyes, his gaze swept over her with that practiced contempt she had now seen him deploy 24 times. The plain cardigan, the unstyled hair, the cheap shoes, the lack of an attorney standing beside her. In the space of 2 seconds, he had filed her into a category he had built his entire career around. Easily intimidated, easily fined, easily forgotten. Adrian Carter, he read from his sheet, drawing out the syllables with theatrical boredom. Jaywalking, crossing against a pedestrian signal at the intersection of Marietta Street and Spring Street at 6:30 in the morning. Do you have legal representation, Ms. Carter, or are you going to embarrass yourself by attempting to represent yourself? A few people in the gallery snickered. Whitman smirked at his own joke. Adrian kept her face perfectly neutral. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Of course you will," Whitman said with an exaggerated sigh, leaning back in his chair. "Because everyone in this courtroom apparently went to law school in their bathroom mirror." "Fine. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." Whitman actually laughed. A short, dry, contemptuous bark of a laugh. "Not guilty to jaywalking at 6:30 in the morning, with a written citation from a sworn officer of the Atlanta Police Department. This ought to be entertaining. Go ahead, Ms. Carter, astonish me." Adrian took a small breath, perfectly measured, and began. "Your Honor, under Atlanta Municipal Code Section 15129, the offense of pedestrian disobedience requires that the pedestrian's conduct create a hazard or impede the lawful flow of traffic. The citation issued to me by Officer Daniels contains no such allegation. The intersection in question was completely empty of vehicular traffic at the time of the alleged infraction. I have surveillance footage from a nearby business confirming this. Therefore, I respectfully move to dismiss the citation on the grounds that an essential element of the offense was not pled in the charging document." The courtroom went very, very quiet. The bailiff's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. The court stenographer's fingers paused over her keys for half a second before resuming. In the gallery, a public defender who had been scrolling through his phone slowly lowered it and stared. Judge Harold Whitman's smirk did not just fade, it curdled. His face went from amused condescension to a tight, mottled red in the span of about 3 heartbeats. He had been corrected, in his own courtroom, by a woman in a cheap cardigan, in front of an audience. "Sit down, sweetheart," he snapped, and that was the moment, that exact moment, when the words left his mouth that would later be read aloud at a state bar of Georgia disciplinary hearing. "This is a courtroom, not a beauty pageant, and I don't have time for whatever theatrical performance you think you're about to give me." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the gallery. Whitman fed on the sound. He leaned back further into his chair, the smirk now fully restored. He was performing again. Adrian did not move. She did not blink. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make every person in that room understand that something unusual was happening. "I'll stand, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Unless, of course, standing is also against the rules in your courtroom." The smirk faltered. The court stenographer's eyes flickered up toward Adrian for the first time, and something like cautious recognition passed across her face. Margaret Holloway had been transcribing Harold Whitman's words for 19 years, and she had never, not once, heard anyone respond to him with that kind of quiet, unshakable composure. She did not yet know who Adrian Carter was, but she knew in that instant that she was watching something extraordinary unfold. Whitman recovered quickly. He had been humiliating defendants for 2 decades, and he was not about to let some smart-mouthed woman in a thrift store sweater rewrite the dynamic of his courtroom. He leaned forward over the bench, planting both elbows on the wood, and fixed Adrian with the kind of glare he usually reserved for defendants he was about to send to the holding cell. "Let me explain something to you, Ms. Carter, since you clearly fancy yourself an attorney," he said, his voice slow and dripping with mockery. "In my courtroom, I decide what gets argued and what doesn't. You don't get to come in here quoting random sections of the municipal code that you probably looked up on your phone in the hallway 5 minutes ago. You don't get to lecture me about elements of an offense. You got a ticket. The officer says you crossed against the signal. That's the end of the discussion." "Your Honor, with respect," Adrian said, her voice as calm as still water. "I am not lecturing the court. I am asserting a defense. Under Georgia law and under the 6th Amendment of the United States Constitution, I have the right to present a defense to the charge against me. I have brought evidence. I am asking only that the court consider it." Whitman's face went a shade darker. "Don't you dare quote the Constitution at me in my own courtroom." "I would never presume to teach Your Honor the Constitution," Adrian replied, and there it was, just for a flicker of a second, the faintest hint of steel underneath the polite words. The bailiff caught it. The stenographer caught it. Whitman, blinded by his own rage, did not. "I am merely exercising the rights it guarantees." "You are exercising my patience is what you're doing," Whitman snapped. He picked up his gavel and tapped it lightly against the block, a warning. "I'm going to tell you one time, Ms. Carter, one time. You are going to stop arguing. You are going to enter a plea of guilty. You are going to pay the fine, and you are going to leave my courtroom. Or you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation. Do you understand me?" "I understand the choice you are offering me, Your Honor," Adrian said. "I am respectfully declining it. I am entering a plea of not guilty, and I am asking the court to receive my evidence." The gavel came down, hard, crack. The sound echoed off the cheap wood paneling. A woman in the gallery actually flinched. "Fine," Whitman barked. "You want to play this game, we'll play. I find you guilty. I am imposing the maximum statutory fine of $500. And because you have shown a willful and contemptuous disregard for the authority of this court, I am holding you in civil contempt and adding an additional $750 to that. That's $1,250, payable to the clerk before you leave this building, or you will be remanded into custody until you can produce the funds." "Do you have anything else you'd like to say, Ms. Carter?" The gallery had gone utterly silent. $1,250 for a jaywalking ticket at an empty intersection at 6:30 in the morning. Even the people who had been cheering Whitman on all morning shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't justice anymore. This wasn't even the casual cruelty they had grown used to. This was naked vindictiveness, and everyone in the room could feel it. "Yes, Your Honor," Adrian said, and her voice had not risen a single decibel. "I would like to formally object on the record to the contempt finding. I have not raised my voice. I have not used profanity. I have not disrupted these proceedings. I have stated a legal defense in a polite, measured tone. The contempt citation is therefore not supported by the factual record and constitutes a violation of my due process rights under the 14th Amendment. I am requesting that my objection be noted by the court reporter, and I am requesting a certified copy of today's transcript. Will the court grant that request?" Margaret Holloway, the stenographer, did not wait for Whitman to answer. She simply nodded once, almost imperceptibly, toward Adrian and continued typing. Whitman's face was now the color of raw beef. He stared at Adrian with the open, unguarded hatred of a man who had just realized he was being outmaneuvered and could not understand how. "You want a transcript," he said, his voice rising into something close to a shout. "You want to spend more of your hard-earned money on a piece of paper that's going to tell you exactly what I just told you, which is that you are guilty. Go ahead. Buy yourself a souvenir. Frame it on your wall. Maybe it'll remind you next time to keep your mouth shut and show some respect when you're standing in front of a judge." Adrian did not respond to the insult. She simply reached down into her canvas tote bag, withdrew a slim leather wallet, and produced a black credit card. Not a flashy one. Not a centurion or anything designed to announce wealth. Just a simple, matte black card from a private wealth management firm that anyone who actually knew what they were looking at would have recognized instantly. The kind of card Harold Whitman had never held in his life. He didn't recognize it. He just saw a card. "I'll pay the fine in full, Your Honor," she said, "and I'll be requesting that transcript from the clerk's office before I leave the building." She turned away from the bench, walked over to the clerk's window, and placed the card on the counter. The young clerk, a woman in her late 20s with tired eyes, processed the transaction with shaking fingers. $1,250, the clerk whispered apologetically, as if she herself had imposed the fine. "Yes, I know," Adrian said gently. "It's not your fault. Please don't apologize." Then, in a voice pitched low enough that Whitman couldn't hear but loud enough for the court reporter's microphone to pick up, she added, "I would like a fully itemized receipt, including the specific charge code for the contempt citation and the name and badge number of the citing officer on the original infraction. And I would formally like to request the certified transcript of these proceedings, expedited delivery, billed to the same account." The clerk's eyes flickered upward, and there was something there now, something that hadn't been there before: curiosity. The The clerk had been working that courtroom for 3 years, and in 3 years she had never once seen a defendant request a certified transcript. Most of them didn't even know it was their right. This one knew exactly what she was doing. The receipt printed out with a soft mechanical whir. Adrienne folded it carefully, slipped it into her wallet, and tucked the wallet back into her tote bag. Then she turned and walked the length of the center aisle one more time, her sensible flats making no sound on the worn carpet. She did not look back at the bench. She did not need to. As she reached the heavy wooden doors, Whitman's voice rang out behind her, one last petty stab at the back. "And Ms. Carter, maybe next time try a little humility. It would serve you better than that attitude." She paused, her hand on the door. She turned slowly and looked directly at him. The mask of the meek, intimidated defendant slipped just for an instant, just long enough. Her eyes were calm, patient, almost amused. "Thank you for the advice, Judge Whitman," she said softly. "I'll be sure to keep it in mind." Then she pushed open the door and walked out. The doors swung shut behind her, and the moment the latch clicked, Adrienne Carter let out a long, slow breath. The hallway outside was nearly empty now, the morning rush of cases having thinned. She stepped into a quiet alcove near the elevators, pulled out her personal cell phone, the secure one, and dialed a number from memory. Marcus picked up on the first ring. "Tell me you're alive," he said. "I'm alive," Adrienne replied, her voice now stripped of every ounce of the meekness she had been wearing for the last 2 hours. It was clipped, sharp, fully back to the voice of a woman who ran one of the largest district attorney's offices in the southeastern United States. "And Marcus, I want you to listen to me very carefully because we have work to do." He didn't just take the bait, Marcus. He swallowed it whole, Adrienne said into the phone as she walked briskly out of the courthouse and into the rain. The black SUV she had arranged to meet her 2 blocks away was already idling at the curb. "He called me sweetheart on the record. He told me to sit down. He refused to hear my motion. He imposed a $500 maximum fine and a $750 contempt citation without any factual basis for the contempt finding. The entire thing is on the stenographer's record." Marcus exhaled audibly on the other end of the line. "Jesus, Adrienne, $12.50 for jaywalking." $12.50, she confirmed, sliding into the back seat of the SUV and pulling the door shut. The driver, a former Secret Service agent named Reggie, met her eyes in the rearview mirror and gave her a single nod. He had been told nothing about her morning, but he could read her face like a book. "Take me back to the office, Reggie." "The long way. I need to think." The SUV pulled smoothly into traffic, and Adrienne returned her attention to the phone. "Here's what I need from you, and I need it fast," she continued. "First, I want the certified transcript of this morning's proceedings on my desk within 48 hours. I've already requested it through the clerk's office, but I want you to follow up personally with Margaret Holloway, the court reporter. She's been transcribing for Whitman for 19 years. Approach her carefully. I think she'll cooperate, but I don't want her to feel pressured. Second, I want the case files for every single matter Judge Harold Whitman has presided over for the past 10 years. Every sentencing decision, every contempt citation, every fine. I want it broken down by the defendant's race, gender, age, and whether they had legal representation. I want disparity analysis. I want it bulletproof, peer-reviewable, ready to be submitted to the Judicial Qualifications Commission. Third, I want every formal and informal complaint that has ever been filed against him. Bar complaints, JQC complaints, news articles, op-eds, social media posts from public defenders, anything. I want it organized chronologically and cross-referenced with the case data." "That's going to take weeks," Marcus said. "You have 3. There was a brief, heavy pause on the line. Then Marcus, who had been Adrienne's right hand for 9 years and who knew exactly when to stop pushing back, simply said, "Understood. Anything else?" "Yes. One more thing, and this is the most important one. The Georgia Judicial Conference Annual Ethics Symposium is happening at the Atlanta Marriott Marquis in 3 weeks. I am the keynote speaker. Judge Harold Whitman has applied for an invitation every year for the last 6 years, and every year he has been politely declined because of his reputation. This year, I want him to receive a personal, hand-delivered invitation from the office of the district attorney. I want him seated in the front row, and I do not want him to know I am the keynote speaker until I walk out onto that stage." Another pause. Then very softly Marcus said, "Adrian." "That is cold." "No, Marcus," she said, and her voice was steady. "That is justice. Cold is what he did to Eugene Patterson this morning. Cold is what he said to that young mother about birth control. What I'm planning is accountability. There is a difference, and I want every judge in the state of Georgia to understand the difference by the end of next month." Marcus didn't argue further. He simply said, "I'll have a preliminary dossier on your desk by Friday." The line went dead. Adrian let the phone drop into her lap and stared out the rain-streaked window at downtown Atlanta sliding past. She thought about Mr. Patterson, the elderly man whose dying wife had been mocked from the bench that morning. She thought about the young mother with the broken taillight, calculating in her head whether she could pay the $400 fine and still make rent. She thought about the Vietnamese man, the homeless veteran, the teenager on the bicycle, each of them a name she had quietly written in her notebook, each of them a person she fully intended to make whole before this was finished. The fines they had paid that morning under Whitman's gavel would be reviewed. The records would be examined. And where injustice had been done, restitution would follow. That was a promise she was making to herself in the back seat of that SUV, and Adrian Carter did not break promises. The next 3 weeks moved with the controlled urgency of a military operation. Marcus assembled a small, hand-picked team of senior assistant district attorneys, 2 paralegals, and a forensic data analyst on loan from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and they worked in a secured conference room on the 11th floor of the Fulton County Justice Center that Adrian had quietly designated as the war room. The door was kept locked at all times. The windows had been covered with privacy film. No one entered without an authorized key card, and no one discussed the contents of the work outside that room. Margaret Holloway, the court stenographer, had not only cooperated, she had wept quietly in Marcus's office when he had finally explained who Adrian Carter actually was. Margaret had been holding 19 years of horror inside her own conscience, and she had brought with her her own carefully archived backup files of transcripts that the official court record had quietly buried over the decades. The forensic data analysis was devastating. Across 10 years and over 14,000 cases, Judge Harold Whitman had imposed maximum fines on black defendants at a rate 4.2 times higher than on white defendants charged with identical infractions. He had issued contempt citations against black women at a rate 7 times higher than any other demographic group. He had refused to consider evidentiary documentation, hospital records, employment letters, character references, in over 60% of cases involving defendants of color, compared with under 9% for white defendants. The numbers did not lie, and they did not bend, and they did not soften no matter how many ways the analysts sliced them. Adrian reviewed the spreadsheets in the war room one rainy Tuesday evening, alone, and when she finished she set the binder down on the table, closed her eyes, and allowed herself a single, slow exhale. Then she opened her eyes and got back to work. The dossier eventually grew to 147 pages, double-sided, professionally bound, with 3 separate appendices containing the certified transcript of her own hearing, the statistical analysis, and sworn affidavits from 23 former defendants whom Marcus's team had tracked down and interviewed. The affidavits included one from Mr. Eugene Patterson, the elderly widower who had cried during his interview and asked whether anything could be done for the $250 he had paid that morning while burying his wife. Adrian had personally signed the order, 3 days later, refunding the fine and vacating the conviction. Mr. Patterson was the first. He would not be the last. The plan was for the district attorney's office to file a sweeping post-conviction relief motion within 60 days of the gala, seeking to vacate or reduce every disproportionate sentence Whitman had imposed in the past decade, where the data showed clear racial disparity. Restitution would be paid from a settlement fund that Adrian had already begun negotiating with the city. While all of this was being assembled in the locked conference room on the 11th floor, Harold Whitman was, in his own way, also preparing for the gala. The hand-delivered invitation from the district attorney's office had arrived at his chambers 2 weeks before the event, and he had practically danced around his desk reading it. After 6 years of being snubbed, he had finally been invited to the most prestigious legal gathering in the state. He interpreted it, as Adrian had known he would, as a sign that his political fortunes were finally turning. He went out and purchased a new tuxedo from a high-end men's store in Buckhead, charging it to a credit card that was already alarmingly close to its limit. He scheduled an appointment for a haircut and a beard trim. He drafted, and then redrafted, a list of senior judges and political donors he intended to corner at the cocktail reception. The invitation specifically noted that he had been seated at table 3, directly in front of the main stage, and Whitman read this as confirmation that he was finally, after 22 years of waiting, being recognized as the rising star he had always believed himself to be. He told his wife, over dinner that night, that he expected an appellate court appointment to follow within the year. She nodded politely and said nothing. She had stopped believing his promises a long time ago. The night of the Georgia Judicial Conference annual ethics symposium arrived with the kind of crisp, clear October weather that seemed designed specifically for important events. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Marriott Marquis had been transformed into something out of a magazine. Round tables draped in deep navy linen, crystal centerpieces catching the light from a dozen enormous chandeliers, a stage flanked by towering arrangements of white roses and magnolia branches. 800 of the most powerful legal professionals in the state of Georgia filled the room. State Supreme Court justices sipped champagne with federal appellate judges. Senior partners from the most prestigious law firms in Atlanta circled the room shaking hands with state senators and the attorney general. Television cameras from 3 local news stations were set up along the back wall to film the keynote address. It was, by any measure, the most important night of the year for anyone serious about a future in Georgia law. Judge Harold Whitman arrived at 6:30 in the evening in his new tuxedo, his silver hair freshly cut, his beard trimmed into precise lines. He moved through the cocktail reception with the practiced energy of a man who believed his moment had finally arrived. He cornered a state Supreme Court justice near the bar and held him hostage for nearly 15 minutes with stories about his tough but fair approach to municipal sentencing. He found the lieutenant governor and managed to extract a polite but vague promise to stay in touch. He distributed his embossed business cards like a man scattering grain among pigeons. He did not notice, because his ego would not allow him to notice, that almost everyone he spoke to politely excused themselves within minutes. He did not notice the cool, careful distance that the most senior judges in the room kept between themselves and him. He saw only what he wanted to see, which was a roomful of his future colleagues finally recognizing his greatness. He was on his 3rd glass of Cabernet, working his way toward a federal district judge near the silent auction display, when his eyes caught a flicker of motion near the VIP curtain at the side of the stage. A woman in a stunning floor-length gown of deep burgundy silk had just emerged, escorted by the chairman of the State Bar of Georgia. She was tall, regal, her natural hair styled into a magnificent crown of twists threaded with gold pins, diamonds glinting at her ears, her makeup flawless. She was surrounded by a small but visibly important cluster of people: the Attorney General of Georgia, the chief of the Atlanta field office of the FBI, a United States senator, all of them leaning in to hear what she was saying. Whitman squinted across the room. He took a step closer. He squinted harder. The wine glass in his hand began, almost imperceptibly, to shake. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a trick of the light, a passing resemblance. Black women, his prejudice told him, often looked alike from a distance. He took another step closer. The woman turned her head and the chandelier light caught her face fully, and Harold Whitman's entire body went cold from the scalp down to the soles of his rented dress shoes. It was her, the same face, the same eyes. The woman from his courtroom 3 weeks ago, the woman in the cardigan, the woman he had fined $1,250, the woman he had called sweetheart on the record. He took a step backward, then another, then bumped into a waiter who was carrying a tray of empty glasses. The waiter apologized. Whitman did not respond. He could not respond. His throat had closed. His brain, his desperate, lying, ego-soaked brain, scrambled for a coincidence. A sister, perhaps. A cousin. A doppelganger. Surely the woman from courtroom 7B was not, could not be, standing here in a gown that cost more than his monthly mortgage, casually chatting with the Attorney General of Georgia. He tried to move toward her to confirm what his eyes were telling him, but the lights in the ballroom began to dim. The orchestra music faded. The chairman of the state bar stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin." A bailiff in a tuxedo gently but firmly directed Whitman toward table 3, directly in front of the main stage. He sat down. His hands were trembling. He set the wine glass down. He could not pick it back up. The chairman of the state bar tapped the microphone. The room fell silent, and his warm, resonant voice filled the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, honored guests, it is my privilege tonight to introduce our keynote speaker. She is a trailblazer, a reformer, the first black woman ever elected district attorney of Fulton County, and one of the most respected voices in American jurisprudence today. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Adrienne Carter." The ballroom rose as one. 800 people applauded as Adrienne walked out from the wings in her burgundy gown, her shoulders square, her chin lifted, every inch of her radiating the authority she had so carefully hidden 3 weeks earlier. At table 3, directly in front of the stage, Harold Whitman did not stand. He could not stand. His legs had stopped working. The blood had drained from his face so completely that the woman seated next to him, a federal magistrate judge, leaned over and asked if he needed water. He did not hear her. He was staring at Adrienne, and Adrienne, after acknowledging the applause, was staring directly back at him. "Thank you," Adrienne began, her voice filling the room with practiced, easy power. "Tonight we are here to talk about ethics, about the integrity of our profession, about what it means to wear a robe in the state of Georgia. We love to discuss these ideas in beautiful ballrooms over expensive wine, but the truth is that the integrity of our justice system is not measured here. It is measured in the smallest, ugliest, most forgotten courtrooms in this state, where ordinary citizens, often poor, often black, often terrified, first encounter the power of the law. 3 weeks ago, I went to one of those courtrooms. I went in plain clothes. I went without my title, and I sat in the back row and I watched." She paused. The room was utterly silent. She reached down to the podium and lifted a bound document. "I have here the certified transcript of what I witnessed. I would like to share a single quote with you, spoken from the bench to a woman who was attempting, politely and respectfully, to assert a constitutional defense to a $40 jaywalking citation." She opened the transcript. Her voice took on the bored, contemptuous tone she had heard from Harold Whitman so vividly that her own staff had shuddered when she rehearsed it. "Sit down, sweetheart. This is a courtroom, not a beauty pageant." A collective intake of breath rolled through the ballroom. Adrienne kept reading. The contempt citation, the $1,250, the mocking dismissal of a grieving widower earlier that same morning, the remark about birth control to a young mother. By the time she was halfway through the transcript, the silence in the room had taken on a quality of physical weight. Senior judges were leaning forward in their seats. The Attorney General had set down his wineglass. At table 3, Harold Whitman had begun to sweat through his new tuxedo. Adrienne closed the transcript and let it fall to the podium with a soft, deliberate thud. She lifted her eyes and they found Whitman's, and they did not let go. "The judge who said those words," she said, her voice ringing out across 800 witnesses, "is Judge Harold Whitman of the Fulton County Municipal Court. He is seated at table 3. And tomorrow morning, my office will be filing a 147-page formal complaint with the Judicial Qualifications Commission seeking his immediate removal from the bench. along with a sweeping post-conviction relief motion to vacate or reduce every disproportionate sentence he has imposed in the last 10 years. Restitution will be paid. The record will be corrected. And I want every judge in this room tonight to understand something very clearly. She paused and her voice dropped, low and steady and absolutely unshakable. The robe does not make you a king. It makes you a public servant, and the people you serve are watching, always, even when you think they aren't. Within 6 months, Whitman had been removed from the bench, disbarred, and had filed for personal bankruptcy. Over 4,000 of his rulings were vacated or reduced. Mr. Eugene Patterson received his refund with a personal letter from the district attorney. And in courtrooms across Georgia, judges began, very quietly, to behave a little better. Because somewhere out there, a woman in a plain cardigan might be sitting in the back row, taking notes. If this story of poetic justice hit you as hard as it hit Harold Whitman, smash that like button right now and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Adrian's shoes. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story of karma served cold. See you in the next one. Peace.